Hello everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at some macroeconomics. We're going to study aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And we'll try to figure out how aggregate demand and aggregate supply are defined and how they can help determine the level of prices and the level of GDP in the macroeconomy. So let's get started looking at aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, so what we see is that, first off, let's talk a little bit about economics and economists. Economics is a science, but it's not an exact science. and so you have different points of view that exist in economics. One of the most important divisions that we have amongst economists is about macroeconomics, and it divides economists into two groups. The first group being the supply-siders, the people that believe that the supply in the economy is what drives the economy, in particular in the long run. And we've got people that are demand-siders, people that believe very strong, very much in that demand is what drives the economy. And there's some very famous demand-side economists. John Maynard Keynes was one of them. And in supply, we have Say, who was a well-known economist as well. But we have this mix between supply-side economics and demand-side economics. And in reality, we have to really consider both of these to understand the macroeconomy. It's really not an or question. And in many cases, we have both applying, but in different moments of time. So let's take a look at what we mean by supply side and demand side macroeconomics. So supply side is associated with Say, and a famous economist, and Say basically said supply creates its own demand. And the argument is pretty basic. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to our original model of the circular flow of income. So we basically said that in an economy we have households. So we have households over here, and households provide services to businesses. So this is the enterprises over here. So in supply side, they said that, well, if imagine we produce over here, we produce a whole bunch of goods and services, and as we produce, households provide labor to produce whatever we're making, and the enterprises provide with wages. So we're paying for the factors of production. So we increase production, right? As we increase production, we are providing homes and households with wages. And what are they going to do with the wages? Well, they're going to spend it on goods and services. So they spend the money on goods and services. They purchase goods and services, and in exchange, the businesses give them these goods and services. So the supply side basically says, hey, look, we can start by producing. As we produce, we provide income to families. Over here are the households. And as they get income, they spend it on goods and services. So that's how we start the cycle. Let me erase my drawing. So let's go back to our slides. So what do we see? Say basically said that supply creates its own demand. Each time goods and services are produced and sold, it represents income to someone. So I produce the goods and services, I'm going to give people wages, and if I buy goods and services, obviously, it's income to the shop owner as well. But it all starts with production. Now, this is a neoclassical approach, supply-side economics, and these people generally believe in the importance of the supply in the long run in the economy. So if the economy, if we want an economy to be strong, we want to focus on the productive factors of productive resources that we've got to produce, and grow the economy. The supply of resources creates the supply of goods and services. So Say's law that supply creates its own demand does seem a good approximation for the long run. And remember, we spoke about the production possibilities frontier. We talked about, well, where does the how much can we produce in our economy? And that was along the production possibilities frontier, where we have two basic areas where we can use goods and services, and we can produce product A or product B, and we're on some sort of a frontier. And to grow the economy, we have to have more factors of production to push our economy outwards, producing more of A and more of B. So in the long run, economic growth means increased production and increase more resources or more ability to transform resources into product A or product B. And that's what Say is basically saying here, is that in the long run, supply does create its own demand and does seem a good approximation for the long run. But we also know that it's possible that the economy cannot be in that situation. And while over most periods of time, years and decades, as the productive power of the economy grows, so does the demand. We basically track it, but it's not necessarily true all the time. And this is where we need maybe a short-run response. There are times in the short run, in a few months or a few years, that recessions and depressions occur. And for some reason, there seems to be a lack of demand for products. So we're maybe trying to produce, but the demand isn't there. And so there has to be another side of the story. I mean, if it was just supply side, we'd produce, and people would make more money, and we wouldn't have a problem. But we do have problems. We do have recessions. We do have depressions. We do have situations when demand doesn't meet the production. So we have demand-side economics. And demand-side economics is all about Keynes, John Maynard Keynes. And he said demand creates its own supply. And we can go back to our board here, and this is, the exact opposite, right? We've got the circular flow of income. We've got, again, the households. We've got the businesses. Oops. There we go. So we have households over here, and we have businesses over here. And what they're saying is that, you know what? If we demand goods and services from businesses, so the demand is here, we want to buy stuff, we pay for goods and services, we get the goods and services, but to get the goods and services, the businesses have to produce the goods and services. So households give productive factors of production, labor, for example, and then we get wages and salaries in exchange. So it all starts here with the demanders, the households, going to businesses and saying, I want to buy something. So that's the exact opposite of what we saw before, where it was the production that started the whole cycle. So now we've got a situation where households are demanding, or somebody's demanding goods and services, and as they demand, they'll be produced, and as they produce, people make income, etc., etc., etc. But we also know that it's not that simple, because if it were that simple, governments would just buy more and more, and the economy would never go through periods of recession or whatnot. There are limits to how much we can produce. In the long run, we just can't go beyond our factors of production. It just doesn't happen. So in the short run, it sounds like Keynes probably works, that we can demand, and it can drive the economy. But at some point, we can only demand so much, and that's when the supply side economics will kick in. So supply side sounds like something that we're going to have in the long run, and Keynesian demand side economics is probably more short and medium term logic. So aggregate demand and aggregate supply define our model, and we have to figure out how they interact. So aggregate demand and supply will interact like any demand and supply to determine the amount of production and the price level of the goods and services that are sold. Aggregate supply reflects the total quantity of output that we sell, and the aggregate supply curve, we'll see in a minute, shows us that amount at every price level. So at a given price level, what do firms want to produce? The potential GDP is the maximum quantity that the economy can produce given full employment. So if we're using all of our resources to the max, and we've got labor, physical capital, technology, institutions, how much can we produce? That's potential GDP. And full employment GDP is another name for this. So if we're at our potential, if the economy is using all of its labor, physical capital, technology, institutions effectively, we'll be at what's called full employment. And that's an important term to keep in mind. So aggregate supply shows us this relationship between price level on one side here and real GDP. Remember, real GDP is basically production of final goods and services in an economy. And so at every price level, we would expect that as prices go up, this is again holding production costs constant. We're saying, oh, prices go up for final goods and services, not intermediate goods and services, because that would be the cost of production. So as prices go up for my final goods and services, wow, prices are rising, my costs are the same, I'm going to produce more and make more profit. So we see that there's a positive relationship between prices and production. This relationship we see is relatively flat here at low levels of production. Okay, so if prices go up, companies want to produce quite a bit more, but we can see that production levels, even if we increase price a lot, at some point we can't really go too much further. So it becomes quite vertical in the end. It's relatively horizontal here at the lower end. And why do we have this limit? Well, because we have this idea of potential or full employment real GDP. There's a limit onto how much we can make. The economy only has so many people, so much technology, so many resources. And if we try to go beyond it, and here we've got an example of up here, for example, we want to go beyond it. If we try to go beyond our production, we're pushing the economy harder than it can really go. And when we do that, we start generating high degrees of inflation and prices go up quite a bit. So we can try to go beyond this long-run aggregate supply, the LRAS, versus short-run aggregate supply. But as we do, we're really going to put pressure on the economy and prices are going to start going up quite a bit. So that's supply. Now demand is the amount of total spending on domestic goods and services in the economy. It determines real GDP. And demand is made up of these elements. We've seen this before. Consumption, investment by firms, government spending, and net exports. Exports minus imports. And what we see in this demand curve is the relationship between every price, the price level P2. Well, if prices are really high, we're going to demand a lower level of goods and services. As price levels drop, the general price level, remember this is like the deflator, as price levels drop, we'll want to buy more goods and services. So the demand schedule, or this demand curve, tells us how much at all price levels we're ready to buy of final goods and services. It's the demand curve for the economy. But it is, and this is really important here, it's broken down into different elements. It's broken down into consumption, investment, government spending, and here we've got net exports. And those four components, 1, 2, 3, 4, are what's going to drive economic policy when we decide, well, how can we maybe change demand in the economy? So how do they work? Well, if you've got demand here and you've got supply, then we have what's called economic equilibrium. So market equilibrium occurs where supply and demand are equal, and where supply and demand intersect, where we get the price level and we get the level of GDP, real GDP, the amount of goods and services produced in the economy. And that's our market equilibrium for our macroeconomy. Now the short run and the aggregate supply and the long run aggregate supply work together. We can see here that the short run aggregate supply in this case is basically here, and the demand is intersecting at a point that's below our total long run aggregate supply. Long run aggregate supply, again, is vertical. It's basically telling us the limit of what we can potentially do. And here this is called a recessionary gap. And I'll explain this to you. Here we've got a situation where we can produce over out to here. Our potential for the economy is here, but in fact we're only producing here. We're lower than our potential. So it's kind of like when you were looking at the business cycles. We know our economy goes up and down like this, right? And there's a trend line that looks like this. So if we're at a point here, for example, if we're at a point here, our production is low and we could be above it. The trend says we can be up here, but we're actually below it. So here we've got a case where production, GDP, is actually below the potential GDP, which is here. So we're in what's called a recessionary gap. And this is where we get unemployment. I mean, the business cycle says we're below GDP, potential GDP. So we're producing less than what we could be producing, which is out here. Guess what? We have unemployment. If we get to this point, if we can expand the economy out to the long-run aggregate supply, then we'll be at full employment, and full employment real GDP as well. So aggregate supply and aggregate demand both shift. And they allow us to find equilibrium in the economy. And I'll show you how this works and how we can actually find a natural equilibrium. So first question, how will an increase in productivity change the aggregate supply curves? Well, let's take a look at that. And to do that, I'll come back to my blackboard. So again, we can take demand. We've got aggregate demand. We've got real GDP here, and we have our general price levels up here. And we've got short-run aggregate supply and maybe long-run aggregate supply here. So long-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate supply, which is the curve. Now, if we improve productivity, imagine we can now change the way we produce and transform our inputs. Well, we can produce more at every given price level. Instead of only producing, for example, if we're at this price level here, instead of just producing this amount, we can now produce much more, maybe over here. And so what we do is we see that the short-run aggregate supply will in fact shift out. So as we become more productive, we can provide more goods and services. Now, an important point is that because we've changed something that's structural in our economy, because we've changed the productivity of something, it's not something that's going to go away. We've learned how to be more productive, and that learning helps us to continue to be more productive. And so another thing that's going to happen is that our long-run supply will also increase. So long-run aggregate supply will also shift out because of this increase in productivity. So that's an important point to note, is that if we increase productivity, we'll change aggregate supply curves. What if we increase the price of intermediate goods and services? Now this is another question. So if we increase the price of, let's say, intermediate goods and services, what's going to happen? So this is an example. Let's say wages go up for some reason, or an input price, the cost of cotton goes up overall in the economy, or something like that. So we've got intermediate goods. So again, I've got my demand curve, and let me go to maybe another color here for the supply curve. So we've got short-run aggregate supply, and we've got, our long-run supply as well. This is the limit of our economy, how much we can produce. Now, what happens if the price of inputs for example, the price of intermediate goods, this is GDP, and this is price levels here. If the price of intermediate goods rise, what we would expect is that the production, the amount that we are ready to produce, would decrease. So short-run aggregate supply would come backwards. So we'd see a shift left of short-run aggregate supply. But, and this is important, it's not going to change long-run aggregate supply. It's not something that's affecting the productive capacity of the economy. We don't have a new way of, we haven't modified how we transform goods and services. We haven't modified the amount of capital or people or things like that. We've just changed the relative price of an intermediate good. So a change like a change in the price level of employment or intermediate good is not going to have an effect on our productive capacity, where we can be in the long run. Aggregate supply can also shift due to unexpected shocks in input goods or labor. For example, a weather event, for example, if there was a storm or something like that, could decrease the short-run aggregate supply. But again, a weather event like that is not going to have a long-term impact. It'll just affect the short-run supply. So here we've got aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We've got a situation where we have an increase in productivity, and we've moved out. We've moved our long-run aggregate supply to the right, and short-run aggregate supply has also increased. And what do we see? Well, what we'll see in this economy is as we move this out, we'll come to a new equilibrium, which will be here, probably with a lower level of prices and a higher level of production. But we're still less than our potential, because the long-run aggregate supply is also shifted. If we have an increase in input prices, again, the short-run aggregate supply will decrease, and our economy will find a new equilibrium, which is here, with higher prices. So we have some inflation and lower overall production. It's going to decrease our production down to this level here. So just bear in mind there are differences between this type of shift and temporary shifts. So shifts in aggregate demand. Now remember that aggregate demand is composed of consumption, investment, government spending, and exports minus imports. So again, let me go back to my board here. So aggregate demand is composed, aggregate demand basically, again, let's draw general prices and GDP and general prices. Aggregate demand is composed of consumption by households, investment in or the purchase of plants and equipment and machines by companies, government spending on education, on military, on roads, etc., and net exports. So exports minus imports. Those are the four components of aggregate demand. They're right here. These are the four elements that make up aggregate demand. And if holding price is constant, so imagine we have a price here, and suddenly, I don't know, for some reason, companies, instead of our GDP, the amount of production is down here, let's say. If they become more optimistic, if companies say, oh, the economy is going to become really, really powerful and consumption is going to grow in the future, they're going to say, well, we better invest now. I haven't changed the price, but in the future, or even right now, they're going to say, I want to invest more. And so we see a shift in demand because investment goes up. Maybe consumption doesn't change or government spending doesn't change, but investment goes up because we have an increase. So at a given price level, companies were only buying so much plant and equipment. Now, even at that same price level, they want to buy more plant and equipment because they feel that the economy will improve. So that's a typical shift in aggregate demand. And everything else, anything that shifts these factors, anything that's going to increase consumption, investment, government spending, etc., can help shift the demand. So a shift in aggregate demand to the right means at least one of these components has increased, so a greater amount of total spending will occur at every price level. A leftward shift would mean that one of these components for some reason decreased. What are some reasons why we would see an increase in aggregate demand or a decrease? Well, what about if we have an increase in consumer confidence? If consumer confidence increases, well, then consumption will probably rise. If people say, ooh, I don't need to put money away in savings anymore because things are going to be good in the future, I'll save less and consume more, so consumption is going to rise. If companies are optimistic about the future, again, investment will rise. They're going to buy more goods and services, and total demand will go to the right. What if there's a decrease in the interest rate? How would that affect aggregate demand? Well, we know that this is based on borrowing. So investment, firms will invest more if interest rates fall, and consumers will spend more. They won't save as much because they're making lower money on their savings. So lower interest rate will push up investment, will also push up consumption. How will increase in government spending affect aggregate demand? Well, if governments spend more money, well, they're a key component of aggregate demand, and aggregate demand will also rise and be pushed to the right. These elements drive aggregate demand to a higher level. What about a weak euro? What if people can buy euros? The euro is cheap to buy for Americans. Well, if Americans can buy euros really, really cheap, they're going to buy more and more European goods because they're cheaper. And so exports will go up. And as exports rise, the demand curve moves to the right as well. Those are some ways we shift aggregate demand. So this is a situation where we have aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We have an equilibrium here. And as we move aggregate demand, this is like basically what I was showing in these graphics, if I take aggregate demand and I shift aggregate demand outwards, because I increase consumption or because I increase investment or whatever, what are we going to do? We're going to find a new equilibrium in our economy with a higher price and a higher level of output. Not quite at the potential, but almost. So demand, we're going to push up demand. What do we see? We see prices going up. We see production increasing. As production increases, we get closer to full employment GDP, or unemployment, cyclical unemployment is going to start to decrease. Now, how do we get back to full employment? Can we move to full employment naturally? So, yeah, we can. And let me explain how that works. I've got to pull up my chalkboard. Okay, so let's push it. Let's position the economy. Oops, pardon me about that. Let's position the economy in a situation as follows. We've got GDP, real GDP here. We've got our price levels up here. And we've got long run aggregate supply, which is here. We've got short run aggregate supply that looks like this. And we have demand, and I'll put demand in blue. We've got, oh, pardon me here. We've got demand, aggregate demand is here. Now, what's going to happen? You can see that in this situation, production is below potential. We could be out here. This is where we can be, our potential. But in fact, we're down here. This is where our production is. We're over here. And in this situation, we have unemployment. So we have cyclical unemployment. We're below potential GDP. And because we have cyclical unemployment, well, we have people that are looking for work. And even though wages may not move a lot, at some point, people are going to say, hey, you know what? I'll accept less, or I'll accept a job. Maybe I didn't want to work. And the cost of production will start to fall. So wages, let's say going down is a good example. Wages are going to decrease. And as wages decrease, remember this is the price of final goods and services over here. Well, as wages fall, we're not changing the price of final goods and services. We're decreasing the price of intermediate goods and services, or factors of production. And so my supply will increase because companies can have lower costs of production. They're going to supply more goods and services for every price. And we move down to a new equilibrium where we're producing a little bit more and prices are also there. And this will continue until we get to a point along this long-run aggregate supply curve. We're still not quite where we want to be, and little bit by little bit, production can go down. Production will increase, and wages, let's say, will go down. And this is a movement that takes time. You know, wages will fall, they become unstuck, they will fall, and eventually we'll get maybe to a position like here where we get to short-run aggregate supply crossing aggregate demand at full employment, which is okay, and we have no problem. Now, the challenge with that is that it takes a long time. To move the economy from this point to this point with lower and lower costs and lower wages is going to take a long time. And so economists and politicians maybe aren't ready to wait. And we're not ready to wait overall, because that means that people are still unemployed, and yeah, we can let the market take us back to equilibrium, but it will take time, and people are unemployed for a long period of time, and that's not good either. So how do we move it back to equilibrium without waiting? Well, that's the question that we're going to ask when we look at fiscal and monetary policy, and we'll try to figure out how we can take an economy. Let's go back here to the this last position, where we can take an economy that is not in equilibrium or long-run equilibrium. We're here. We have a recessionary gap. How can we move closer to our limit? How can we bring it back and remove the recession? And that's the role of fiscal and monetary policies. And we'll see that in the next few lectures. Cyclical unemployment, you've got it right here, is when we're in a gap situation. We're not here, let's say, but we have a lower demand. Demand is lower than expected, and we're currently in a situation where we have unemployment. This is cyclical unemployment. We've got, and I've mentioned this before, we've got demand, which is here. The GDP level is lower than where it could be, which is here. And because production is lower, we have, well, how do we decrease production? We decrease production by letting people go. And that's cyclical unemployment. We have basically a business cycle. Last word I want to let you know is that this curved short-run aggregate supply integrates the neoclassical and Keynesian approach, supply side and demand side. The demand side part of the curve is down on the bottom here, where I've written Keynes' name. This is the flatter portion of short-run aggregate supply, and we can see that we can increase demand without having huge increases in prices. And the long-run aggregate supply, which is here, is close to or approximated by this vertical part of the short-run aggregate supply. This is the neoclassical or supply side, which is saying that if we push demand up, we'll just push inflation up. We've hit our limit. We can't go beyond. Supply is controlling. So if we're in a situation where we're currently in a recessionary gap, and that's the case right here, the question we're going to be asking in the next few videos is, well, how do we take our economy and move it beyond where we are today? How do we take it and, let's say, push aggregate demand outwards? How do we grow demand? What can we do as a people, as a government, to push our demand out and put us back into full employment. Here, in this case, obviously with higher prices as well. How do we do it? How do we grow it? And this is going to be the role of fiscal and monetary policy to make that work. Okay, I hope you've understood a little bit about the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. We'll be using this model to understand how fiscal and monetary policy work. So I look forward to seeing you in the next video.